Hi, my name is Emily Talbot, and I'm the Chief Curator of the Norton Simon Museum. And I'm pleased to welcome you to Manet's Philosophers from the Art Institute of Chicago. This exhibition brings together three astounding works by the 19th century French artist Edouard Manet. Two are on loan to us from the Art Institute of Chicago, Beggar with Oysters and Beggar with a Duffel Coat, both subtitled Philosopher and painted by Manet between 1865 and 1867. They're installed flanking one of the icons of the Norton Simon collection, Manet's The Rag Picker, probably painted slightly later, between perhaps 1867 and 1872. Manet loosely grouped these paintings as a series of philosophers when he sold them to the Impressionist art dealer Paul Durand-Ruel in 1872, along with an earlier painting of an absinthe drinker that's now in the collection of the New Carlsberg Glyptothek in Copenhagen. The three paintings on view in this exhibition have been shown together a few times, first at Manet's posthumous retrospective in Paris in 1884, and most recently in Chicago in 1966. But I learned over the course of my research that these three pictures have never been seen on the same wall side by side. So this exhibition gives us a really exciting opportunity to experience the collective power and authority of Manet's works. All three depict down-and-out male figures in a format and medium traditionally reserved for the social elite. This was an interest of Manet's, who had been making works that depicted historical subjects but updated for a modern context really throughout the 1860s. In 1865, Manet was coming off of a difficult year. He had recently exhibited his Olympia and Jesus Mocked by the Soldiers at the Paris Salon, the annual state-sponsored art exhibition in Paris. And these paintings had been pretty seriously criticized, mostly for their subject matter and Manet's particular approach to paint handling. Olympia depicts a Paris prostitute in a pose more familiar from Titian's Venus of Urbino, but without any of the idealization and sentimentality of Titian's approach. Likewise, Jesus Mocked by the Soldiers depicts a Parisian model who was very recognizable as such in an unidealized manner. And Manet used strong contrasts between light and dark that were really unsettling and unfamiliar to Parisian viewers. There was a kind of crudeness to his method of paint handling that people found really striking. Manet himself was confused by the negative criticism, and he wrote to his friend Charles Baudelaire, really saying that he felt deeply misunderstood by all of this. And Baudelaire was not very sympathetic and said, all of the great artists experience this kind of criticism. You need to move on. So Manet's decision at this moment in order to move on was to take a trip to Spain and essentially commune with his art historical hero, the 17th century Spanish artist Diego Velázquez. He then spends about a week, maybe 10 days in Madrid, seeing as many works by Velázquez as he can. And he writes back to friends that he's particularly impressed by Velázquez's Philosophers. These are paintings of the ancient Greek philosophers, Aesop and Menippus, that were then on view in the Prado, though they had been originally painted around 1638 for a hunting pavilion outside of Madrid. Aesop and Menippus depict the ancient Greek philosophers as contemporary Spanish beggars, and this was an approach that Manet admired and really wanted to use for his own work. He was probably already familiar with Velázquez's subjects from Francisco de Goya's prints after them, which we know that Manet consulted in Paris as an art student, and may in fact have owned himself later on. But the experience of seeing Velázquez's works in person had a huge impact on Manet. When he returned to Paris in September of 1865, he immediately took back up the two beggar paintings in the Art Institute's collection. Beggar with a Duffel Coat is named for the jacket that the man is wearing, a kind of cloak with a hood that we think is related to the kind of attire that mariners were wearing in the 19th century. He's been described as the most contemporary of Manet's philosophers, and his costume suggests something like a uniform, although the individual components have never been identified as belonging to a single profession. He's wearing, underneath his duffel coat, another blue jacket, and seems to be wearing some workmanlike pants and boots, and also a red beret. Beggar with Oysters is, of course, named for the small still life that we see in the lower right foreground, this wonderful, swiftly painted representation of opened oyster shells and perhaps a bed of straw, so lightly painted that we can actually see some of the canvas weave through the paint layers. The Beggar with Oysters is the most philosophical of all of Manet's paintings in this series. He seems to be looking slightly past us, his eyes unfixed, thinking about something that we can't quite discern. He's wearing a navy blue cloak and a dark green hat. The cloak covers most of his clothing. We can see just some wrinkled pants and some black shoes with what appear to be perhaps mud or dirt along the soles. Manet has painted the face and even the feet of this man with such confident, swift brushwork. We can really get a sense of the energy and the excitement that he felt after seeing Velázquez's work. The Rag Picker is in many ways a very different work from the two beggar paintings. We know it was painted slightly later than the two beggars because Manet did not exhibit it in 1867 at his one-man exhibition outside the Exposition Universelle in Paris. He's readily identifiable as a rag picker because of the sack that he has over his shoulder and a stick in his hand. And a rag picker was an identifiable profession for viewers in the 19th century. Rag picking was a licensed profession in 19th century Paris. It was a profession in which people went through the garbage and salvaged materials that were still usable, particularly textiles, which were sold to paper manufacturers for use in the production of paper. And we get a sense of how significant the rag picker was to the newspaper industry through a cartoon that was published in the 1880s illustrating each stage of the newspaper's production. And we can see in the first two images that the rag picker is the point of origin for the newspaper. This is the moment where the raw materials for newspaper production are being sourced and distributed. But within the cultural imagination in Paris, rag pickers were also significant and recognizable subjects. They appeared in songs and poems and also were included as one of the social types in a compendium of illustrated stories describing different professions in Paris. So the chiffonnier, which is French for rag picker, was one of the types that was described here, including a representation of the rag picker that looks not unlike our painting. The man is stooped and wearing a top hat, and he seems to be poking at some refuse on the ground with his stick. So why these subjects at this particular moment? In the 1860s, Manet was living in the Batignolles, a neighborhood in northwestern Paris that was undergoing substantial renovation at the behest of Napoleon III, the emperor, and his prefect of the Seine, a man named Baron Haussmann, who oversaw substantial renovations throughout the city of Paris, making it the Paris that we recognize today, with long, wide boulevards and much more light and a sense of busyness in the streets. Living in one of the neighborhoods that was so substantially renovated, Manet was familiar with the types of people that were being displaced as a result of this work in the urban space. And while I don't think he had particular associations with these people, he came from an upper middle class background himself, I think he was sympathetic and found in them a contemporary equivalent to the type of great ancient philosopher that Velázquez depicted. And the figure of the ragpicker in particular had been for some time associated with the artist as a sort of creative profession in which these men made use of the stuff of everyday life. And so by painting a ragpicker, Manet may have been aligning himself with this man in some way. When you see these three works together, you really get a sense of Manet's ambition with this series, that he wanted to update Velázquez and offer a comment on contemporary Parisian life through choosing these subjects.